Hello, hello. Welcome to Cypress, where automated web UI testing isn't just for QA. We're going to start off with a little story of how my team actually got into testing. But we got some fictitious companies because we don't want to call anybody out. So we got ACME Consulting, where we have Bob, our QA engineer. Some teams call them QEs. How many QA or QEs do we have in the room? Couple. We got Katie, our developer. How many of you are developers? Pretty much the rest of you. And then we got Jill, our manager. Any managers in the room? Yeah, I heard a couple. They're a necessary evil. And our Acme Consulting team is working with a company called World Class Coffee, where we have Bill, our client. We want Bill to be happy. We want Bill to keep giving us work. But one day, after another bad release, Jill gets the unwanted phone call. Bill's no longer happy. He's complaining, you guys are taking way too long to deliver your products. You're giving me way too many bugs in each of your deliveries, and it's costing me money. Like any good manager, try to placate Bill a little bit. Oh no, I'm so sorry. Let me get this fixed. Back to the team we go. Houston, we have a problem here. Bill's really angry at us. As you know, our releases have been taking far too long, delivering far too many bugs. We have to fix this before Bill goes somewhere else. And the prime question that always gets asked when you have a QA team, how did stuff escape QA? They're the last kind of stop to prevent this stuff, hopefully. QA, always backpedaling, because nobody likes to be accused of stuff. They're doing the best they can. Typically, we have limited resources. My team has limited resources. We have 8 people developing. We have 2 QA. And they are working on multiple projects, not just mine. It takes days just to manually test Happy Path. You know, same input, same output. That's the stuff that Bob's able to actually work on for the most part. He's not able to work on all the other stuff because he's spending all of his time there. What he really needs is the developers to do a better job of testing. Wants them to really do that Happy Path. But whoa, Bob, let's not do the accusatory thing here. We are testing the best we can. We're poking at stuff. We're trying to run through the test cases too. But we're just as constrained. We have lots of features that we're working on, lots of customer interactions, lots of things they want. Like any good manager, next question is always, can we automate our test? There's got to be a solution to this problem. QA, maybe. We've been looking. We haven't been able to find a tool that has met our requirements. We need something that's not developer-focused because we're not developers. We need something that doesn't create brittle tests. If you make a change in the system, test cases that are unrelated to that change shouldn't break. We need it to be fast. We also want it to be fast to run our tests, not just write them. So far, we just haven't found anything. That's the answer our QA team had given us. They had looked at a ton of products. Thankfully, like all good developers, Katie's been looking at stuff. So Bob, we might be able to help you out. I've been hearing a lot about Cypress. Seen it on podcasts. I've been seeing articles on it. They tout it as way faster, brittle resistant, easy to create test. But there's a big however here. Automating tests is going to take us longer. But the flip side, we'll be able to reduce our QA time. So what do you think Bob's going to say? Well, what do you think Bob's going to say here? But what am I going to do? That's always the worry. Because QA likes their job, and we all need our jobs. We all have bills. Thankfully enough, there's lots of work for QA to do. Honestly, as a QA engineer and as a business owner, it's of very little value to have a QA engineer being paid to do Happy Path testing, standard input, standard output. But the stuff we want them to work on, stress testing, exception testing, security testing, accessibility, There's only so much you can automate in the accessibility space. There's lots of stuff in there. And my favorite, using the UI in weird and unexpected ways. It's amazing how many times my QA team will hit our app and they'll find random bugs because they used it in a different order than all of the developers did. That's the stuff you can't initially automate. And last, you can help Proxy write tests as a QA. Thankfully, there's lots of work, and Bob is happy again. Our primary concern now is, Jill, as a manager, will you give us the time? You have to add it into our sprints. Jill, knowing we need this business done. Let's do it before we lose Bill. That's the typical story that I find most companies, including my own team, have when we get into automated testing. We all know we should be doing testing, we should be automating this stuff, but until something really happens, none of us really think about it. So who am I? I am a web developer. I've been one for the greater part of 20 years now. These days I'm playing mainly in the Angular space with .NET Core as my backend for all my web APIs. Also a DevOps engineer. All of my stuff long before DevOps was an actual term in the industry has been doing CI and CD. I'm also a Scrum Master for my team. Microsoft MVP in web technologies, or developer technologies, I think is the category these days. I'm a founder of a company called Let Your Nerd Be Heard, where I help folks like you communicate to more than just ones and zeros and be able to get on this stage, be able to get better presentations at work. I'd love to talk to any of you that have that desire after the presentation. I'm an award-winning entrepreneur, and I'm also part of an Amazon #1 best-selling book. But enough about me. We're here to talk about Cypress. Before we can get truly into Cypress, we've got to look at testing pyramid. Our standard testing pyramid that every testing talk has normally starts with end-to-end testing. It's about 10% of what we normally test. They're typically slower to run because they're going through the whole system. They typically cost more because you got to create the whole system. Your UIs, your middleware, your backends, your databases, any third-party dependencies all have to be set up to run end-to-end testing. But you have the highest fidelity here, the highest amount of user interaction testing, but they're really expensive. Then we get integration testing, where we start to mock some stuff out. Start mocking out our backends so that all we're working on is testing it just our actual app. We don't make from a web standpoint, we wouldn't make our web call through to our database. The traditional testing pyramid has most of our work in the unit test because they're the fastest to run and they're just cheapest to create. Especially in like the API world, you're testing business logic, lots of business logic. It makes sense to have unit tests because they're super fast. In the UI space, this is quite a bit different. We're going to actually flip this pyramid upside down a bit. And we're going to go integration testing is the majority of our test. We're really concerned with what does the UI do when I take action inside of it. That's the biggest bang for the buck. There's very little true business logic in most of the UIs. We still need our end-to-end testing. As much as I love to have testing in the UI, testing in my API, and have all that, at some point I've got to go through the whole flow and make sure everything truly connects together. So it's about 20%. We bumped it up a tad bit. And unit testing is the smallest portion now because we have a limited amount of true business logic in the UI. Those functions that don't really interact with the UI that change data, that's the stuff that you unit test now, and you leave the integration test for all of the interactions. Because what we're mainly concerned about in our goal is testing all of our interactions and behaviors. If I click a button, does it do what I expect it to do? If I go to try to log in with an invalid account, does it send me to the right spot or give me the right dialog pop-up? That's the interactions that we're trying to test. And for Cypress, it is our next generation web UI testing tool. And it's not constrained by Selenium. Selenium was a great product and still is a great product in many use cases, but it was created over 10 years ago. Technology's changed a bit. Some of the stuff that Cypress helps fix is speed. Cypress runs right in the browser space. So it knows all the things that the browser can do. Animations, it'll wait for them automatically. I don't have to put wait cycles in. Making calls to my API, it can capture those. I don't have to put in any wait cycles. It just automatically waits and keeps retrying. It's also quite a bit flake resistant. Because I don't have to put those wait cycles in, I don't get a lot of false positives. When I've played in the Selenium space, I've got to tell it at times, wait a certain amount of time before you try the next action, because I need to wait for something. Well, what happens when my machine gets a little slow? My wait time might not have been long enough, and now I get a false positive. Cypress already has all of those wait times built in, and it just keeps retrying for me. I don't have to worry about any of those pieces. As well, because it runs in the browser space, anything that you can do in the browser, we can get access to. The last big feature that it gives, debuggability. We get time travel debugging. You'll see actually in the UI in a demo in a moment, every single step I tell it to do, I can click on and see what did the UI look like at that point. If I told it to find an element, it'll highlight the element and tell me what it actually found. Tell it to click on something, I'll get a little red dot over the top of the element that it tried to click on. So I can see all of these actions that it's taken and see exactly where it was at. If I open up the Chrome debug tools, I get even more debugging information. For the elements it found, it'll give me the full HTML for that actual element. So I can look through a lot of stuff there. So let's see this actually running here. So the app we're going to test is a to-do app that I use in all of my Angular workshops that I give. It's got a login page here. So let's go ahead and get logged in. You can see some validation that popped up there. So make sure there's an email address. Make sure it's an actual email. Make sure the password's at least 6 characters long. When I log in, I get my to-do items here. I can add new ones in. I can check off ones. My counter increments or decrements, depending on if I'm adding or completing. I get a deleted item or box that pops up. If I click cancel, it stays. If I click OK, it'll disappear. I can create new accounts. I have a 404 page here. You can tell I'm an awesome designer because I left the default text. I'm not a designer. Get the name up here when I log in, and then I can log out. So from a Cypress standpoint, when I actually launch Cypress, I get it showing me all of my test cases. So these are all test files that I've already created for this application. And if I run them, it pops up this window here. We'll kick all these. Actually, we're going to rerun this a second time because I have a .only in here. So we want to see all of these test cases run. So it has live reloading built in. Here, it's going to run about 30 tests or so-ish here in about 30 seconds. And it's going through everything that I described in the application, plus a couple more things like making sure I get the right invalid login if I'm not actually logged in with a good account. Checks all my menus. Are they in the right order? Do they have the right links? So you can see it flying through this stuff, and once it's done, we'll look at some debuggability pieces. Fairly quick. About 45 seconds maybe, 34 seconds, but when this is done. There's no way I could have tested all of that truly in 34 seconds and made sure that all of my text matched what I expected it to be. Did the colors look right? No way in 35 seconds could I do that. And if I go pick one, let's look at should create an account here. So first thing it's going to do, for every test, you're going to go visit a page and see what the page looks like. I check my path names. I want to make sure it didn't redirect me to someplace. But now I can start getting control, so you can see it highlighted on the screen. What control did it actually find? I type something in it, and you'll see that text here in a moment. Same thing for the password. Now I tell it, find the sign up button. I click on it, and so you can start seeing here how easy it is to go through and debug and see exactly where my UI was. There's no guessing game here of where my UI is at. And say it didn't pick something that I wanted it to pick, well, I can go in here and start writing actual selectors and see where is stuff at. So if I do .btn, actually, let me sign into the home page here. So if I knew where all of these selectors were, you can put selectors in here. It'll go through. It'll actually put them on the page. It makes it really easy to test out what do my selectors actually look like. So I get this for every piece of my code here, and if I open up the debug tool, let's here, zoom in a bit, and let me pick one of the getting of the items. So here's all the HTML for that button, so I can actually look and go, what was the full HTML? One thing that I try to do here as well, and we'll look at this in a bit, is this data-cy. I had an attribute onto all of my elements, so I don't have to worry about my designer actually going and changing ID names, class names. That's a way to get around having brittle test. Simple data-cy. I know my designer is going to leave it alone and not change that stuff around. So this is what the Cypress UI looks like for us. Let's look at what some of this code actually looks like. There's a slew of things that this thing can do, and we're going to dig into all of these. Everything sits off of the CY, short for Cypress. So Cy object, and every one of them is chainable. So first thing every test does, you need to visit a URL. Simple as cy.visit, give it your actual URL location. So /unknown here. And we'll cover why the URL is not full there in a little bit. But now I can check my location. Say .location path name. So go get me my location's URL from the first slash on. Then I say .should, make it equal to something. Say I want it to equal and give it that text value. So simple as that, I've navigated to a page and I check that I'm actually on the right page. When I want to get an element, cy.get, give it a selector. They're all jQuery selectors. I know some of you are going, I don't want to add jQuery to my app. And the good thing is you don't have to add jQuery to your app. It is strictly a Cypress dependency. There is no script that says add jQuery onto my site at all. So here I'm looking at a class, .addBTN. I say, .should contain, and I'm looking for the text. I want my button to have the text add. But here's the data.cy that I mentioned. Same cy.get. Now it's just a square bracket, data.cy equals double quote add btn. Simple as that, a little less brittle resistant. But if I want to click on an event or click on something, same get, now I just say .click. You can start to see the API is really simple to follow. Even the QA engineer that's not a developer can easily read the docs and go, oh, I just need to click on something, .click. If I want to type something into an input field, bet you can guess, .type. You give it the text. And then if you want to actually hit enter at the end of the text, you do the squiggly bracket, type the word enter, and close off your squiggly bracket. That will automatically hit the enter key for you, which is what a lot of users do for single text boxes and want to submit the form. If I want to clear an input field, simple as calling .clear on my element. Really simple API. I can even get multiple elements back. So in the case of my to-do item, I had multiple items there. I want to make sure I get all the items. I can say get my items, and then should have .length, and give it however many I think it should have. You can also get elements by position. So say in that row of to-do items, I want to get the very first row so I can do some inspections on it. Simple as adding either colon first onto the end of my selector, or I can say .eq and give it the number. If it's not the first one, then I can say .eq 2, 3, however many I have, and pull out that exact position. And then I can keep chaining all the other stuff that we saw. I could do a .type, I can do a .click, like all the stuff we saw, I can chain onto the end of these. For my menu, I love to, and all my links, I love to check that, is my href actually set up right? Did I set my Angular routes correctly, since that's the UI framework I'm using? So get my element and say should have an attribute href, and it should include the link /unknown. Really easy to make sure I didn't somehow screw up all of my links. It seems like a simple test, but we've screwed up our menu before in production. Someone's changed the link to a new page that we didn't intend to release yet, or they reversed the order. So I have a test for my order. Is my menu in the right order? Does my menu have the right links? Really easy to do here. Also checking for visibility. So when we weren't logged in, the name disappears out of my header, as well as the logout button is no longer visible. When we're logged in, the login button or logout button now becomes visible. It's as simple as saying .should be .visible. That'll validate, is the logout button there? Or in this case, is my email validation actually showing up? If I want it to be not visible, it's the exact opposite, not .be .visible. Enabled and disabled is very similar. We have not .be .disabled when I want to make sure the button's enabled or that element's enabled. And then disabled is b.disabled. Simple API here. I mentioned earlier that we're really concerned with interaction testing, those integration testing, and less end-to-end testing. That means we need to mock out our APIs. That's where we start using the Cypress server. So cy.server, then I can create my routes. So every one of my API calls that needs to be made on that given page, I'll say cy.route, tell it what URL. It takes in wildcards for the URL, so if you have cache busting in your URL, something that constantly is changing, like a date string or something to make it so that the browser doesn't cache, you can just put a star at that point in your URL here. You give it our status code. We give it our method. It can be any one of the rest kind of methods. Get, post, put, delete, patch. And then we give it our response, whatever JSON object is coming back from our API. You can easily get those out of the Chrome DevTools and just copy and paste them in here and then modify the data. Make sure when you check this in, you don't check in sensitive data into your source control system. But at least you can get the response. You don't have to do it by hand right out of the Chrome DevTools. And then the last thing, you want to give it an alias so you can refer back to it. Because you do have to tell it at some point to wait for that. So .as, and then you give it the name, whatever you want it to call. In this case, identity. And then to wait for the call, cy.wait, and in a single quote, put an @ sign in, and then whatever your alias is. So when Cypress encounters this, it's going to wait for that call to finish. What's really nice is it looks the same way if I wasn't mocking it out. If I took out the response in the previous slide, it would make a call to my actual API, and I could still refer to it and tell it to wait for that to come back. So, any questions before we delve into some code? Just look at how we actually create one of these tests. The test we're going to look through is, how do I actually create an account? So going through the sign-up page, filling in the email, filling in the password, clicking the button, being redirected back to the home page. Because all of our stuff is based on Jasmine under the covers, we get to describe. Right? So this is a grouping of tests. Give it some name. Give it some values. In this case, I have a bogus username and password, just so I don't have to create one on the fly. Then we have a before each. So this says run this bit of code before every one of my test cases. One thing you'll encounter with the CY servers, once you set up a route, if you've used that route, it doesn't go to it a second time. And so we reset our route each time, set up our identity for whatever user, again, so we're basically mocking out our user response, and we're going to mock out our to-do object. I'm just going to tell it, as a new account, I'm going to have 0 to-do items. So just return back an empty array here. So now when I go create my test, I'm going to mock out my post here. I'm going to give it whatever I need to pass in. Then I'm going to visit my page. So I just set up all of my stuff beforehand. So I'm basically arranging everything at this point, setting all of my routes up before I visit my page. Now I visit my page. I get my items here, type in my username, password, click the sign up button, or find the sign up button. I'm going to verify, is the text correct on my box, or my button, make sure it actually says sign up. And then I'm going to click on the button, and now I'm going to have to wait. I need to wait for it to run the sign up, need to wait for it to get back my user, wait for it to get my to-do items, and then I can verify, did I actually get redirected to the home page? Not a whole lot of code to be able to do a simple test like this. But doing this over and over is kind of obnoxious. And that's why we want to automate all of these pieces. And it just keeps going down here, checking to make sure that my logged in username is actually in the header. So grabbing my right menu item, making sure it says welcome and whatever that username was up top. When I click on the logout button, mock that out again. Go through, click on logout, make sure I got redirected to the login page, and make sure that my logout button's no longer visible. We've got all kinds of other form validation if I scroll far enough down as well, here, where I can test every bit of my form validation. So is the email required? So if there's nothing in the box, it should say you need to put in an email. If I type in something like just the number 1, That's obviously not a valid email. So I can go through and make sure, did my validation actually fire? Did I get the right error messages in here? Is my logout button, or my login button in this case, is it disabled? If I haven't passed validation, my rules are the buttons to do something are actually disabled. You can also do it, check like, what happens if I type something in the field and then I clear it out? It's going to say emails required again. So just in this simple case, I've got 4 different validators. Is it required? Did you actually make it an email? If I cleared it out, did the require fire? And then if I actually put in a real email address, everything looks good. And my button in this case, though, is still disabled because I haven't got to the password. One thing that's very different that we haven't covered with Cypress, unlike unit tests that are stateless, Cypress is stateful. So every one of these tests build on top of each other. That's why I'm able to separate them out like this and not have one just gigantic test that says form validation. And they're stateful at the point that I say cy.visit. So if I were to tell it before each to go revisit the same page, it's going to reset my state. That's why it's in the before, the very, very top saying, go visit my page once and build all this stuff up. So the very bottom of my password test, here's where I say, now that everything's valid, now make my button enabled. So all of these test cases, but I've got maybe 300 lines of code in the account page, covers my sign up, covers my login, covers my navigation between the 2 pages for 300 lines of code. And it literally took me reading the Cypress docs about 2 hours to create all of these. It's really quick to create stuff. Let's look how we can get this installed, though. Can't be much easier than this. npm install --save-dev Cypress. The very first time that you run Cypress, and you're going to run it, we'll come back to that previous slide, we're going to run it with an npx Cypress open. That pops up the UI that we're looking at. First time you run it, it does 2 things for you. It goes and downloads their UI. When you do the npm install initially, it downloads the framework for development. Open downloads it so you can actually see the UI. It also scaffolds out a slew of tests. So if I stop this test from running, and let's look at the other set of tests. So the project I have here is just a basic Angular project. I just created it and did nothing more than that npm install Cypress, ran npx Cypress open, and I got all of these files that it created for me. About 105 test cases. If I do npx Cypress open here, while that is running, one thing to be very aware of is if you open up other tabs in the Cypress UI, when you stop running your Cypress test, it instantly kills that UI and your tabs are gone. So don't use those tabs for anything important. So we're going to see it run through a website that they have called their kitchen sink demo. It's example.cypress.io. And it basically has everything I'm talking about, plus a ton more stuff around how do you do most things that you would do in an actual application. How do you query for stuff? How do you look at navigation? And all that stuff. And so for their testing, they give you all the tests that they actually run against that website. And it's very well documented code, too. So if I just pull up any one of these, so they've got all kinds of comments in here. They tried to make them reasonable, so you can read through it and understand what the code is doing. I have copied and pasted a ton of stuff out of here. So I went, oh, how do I do this? And I go look at the file name. Like, I go pull the file names back up. You go, oh, I need to do some assertions. Like, here's a ton of assertions that do. I need to play with cookies. They've got cookie examples here. Local storage, location, network request. Pretty much everything that you could think that you might want to do, they've got a sample for, and they give you their test cases of how they're testing it. So all 105 test cases. So a great way to get started with Cypress. Cypress also has fantastic docs. So if I actually pull up that example site, so they call it their kitchen sink. Every one of their files that you saw in that solution has a corresponding menu item here. and they give you all the code so you can see what it's actually going to do. You can easily cut and paste out of here right into your own code. You can also configure Cypress for viewports. By default, the width is 1,000 pixels and the height is 600. You can change that either as a global configuration. There's a cypress.json file you can add in the root of your project, where you put this JSON object that I'm showing on screen. Or you can say cy.viewport, and for a given test, you can change the viewport at that level. Here's where you can also configure your base URL. So you notice none of my test examples had a full URL path. It just had the page I wanted to go to. This is how you get away with that. Say base URL and give it whatever that is. In my case, I'm on localhost port 4200. You can also blacklist certain sites if you wanted to skip over waiting for them. Like Google Fonts tends to give some issues inside of the environment that I typically work in because we have some proxy servers, and it doesn't like to go out and get those sometimes. I don't want it to wait 30 seconds just to fail to get those and then run my test. I tell it skip right over those. Before we delve into some stuff beyond the basics, any questions on the basics of Cypress? So the question is, I notice you're using Angular, which is TypeScript, but you're not using TypeScript for Cypress. Is there a reason? There is actually absolutely a reason for that one. I've kept running into issues with the TypeScript side of Cypress. So all of their docs are in JavaScript, and so I found that didn't feel like TypeScript was as well baked as their JavaScript side. And I got tired of just running into random things. Like for the dialog that popped up to say, do you want to delete the item, okay or cancel? Until they came out with their latest version, somebody forgot to stub out the TypeScript interface, so it would just fail and say, there's no interface that I can actually connect to. Like just simple things like that kept tripping me up, and it wasn't worth the time to go TypeScript. I wasn't really getting anything out of that. As you can see by the API that we have, there's not a lot of complicated stuff and nothing that TypeScript's really going to benefit me other than to be 100% TypeScript. So I skipped over it. Other questions? How many people want to use this? It's about 3/4 of the room. Fantastic. Hopefully the Beyond the Basics stuff is going to solve some of that. I see a hand up for questions. We will cover that. So the question was, can you run this on a build server or from the command line? We will cover that in a bit. Beyond the basics, what about layout testing? So everything we've covered so far is how do I just test my interactions? It doesn't test, is it in the right spot? Luckily enough, there's a product that's out there called Proxy. Proxy does screenshot testing. So you give it a screenshot, and then you give it your screenshot changes, and it does the diff automatically for you. And luckily enough, somebody wrote a wrapper around Proxy to give us Cypress API for us. So once we go through, and I'll give you the doc link here in a moment, once you install it, you do cy.Proxy snapshot, or you can say Proxy snapshot and give it a name, and it's going to send it up to Proxy every time you run a build from the command line. If I flip over and actually look at Proxy, so I've got a few builds in here. First time you run it, it's going to show you a UI similar to this. This is my very first build I sent to them. There's no snapshot to compare it to, so it's just asking me, do you approve of the snapshots that you actually took? This little thumb up normally would say approve all. I've already approved these ones, and you can see every place that I've actually taken a snapshot here, or a screenshot. So every place where my UI changed, I took a screenshot. Now if I go back and look at my latest build, I actually made a change when I ran this one. You see this red mark is telling me, hey, you have some diff here. It's trying to overlay them so I can see what it is. If I click on the image, then I can see, oh, I changed my title to say to-do list 2. Chances are that was probably not intentional. But if it was, I can go up here and say approve, and then that becomes my gold copy. This makes it way easier for screenshot testing. I've played with lots of screenshot testing tools over the years that typically put them all in a directory, then it fails, and I just got to regenerate everything to go, that one is now my new gold. This makes it way easier for that. You'll notice I'm on a trial at the top here. I believe they have, I want to say it's per month, it's like 500 screenshots. That's on the trial version, and then they have paid plans beyond that. I have zero affiliation with Cypress or Percy. It was just a really cool tool. They did a webinar recently, the two teams, and it literally took me less than half an hour to implement the stuff you're seeing in Percy. And from an install standpoint, it's just another npm install. Well, and we'll look at some code here real quick so you can see what the install actually looks like. Stop that one from running, and we'll go back. Good. So once I do npm install @Percy/Cypress, we have this command.js file that's in our support directory. This is where you can add custom commands of your own into Cypress. I turn on my import in Percy Cypress, and then any place I want to use it, then I need to just call the Percy snapshot, save that. And if I go and run my Percy build, which is, and we will actually run that if I say Percy exe -- Cypress run, we're going to npx Percy exe. I'll close out some of these other windows here. So what it's going to do now is it starts off with Percy, which I haven't set my tokens, so we're not going to look at tokens on video because I don't want to give that one away. But what it would do is I basically get a token, I set it on the command line, then I go run this Percy executable command. Every place that it sees a Percy snapshot, it's going to send it up to Percy as a new build number for me, and then I can go in there and look to say, do I approve it, not approve it? The one piece of Percy that's not obvious whatsoever to me, I actually had to tweet at them and ask, how do you do it? You notice in their UI here, where's the reject button? There is no reject button. You either approve it, or you leave it sitting here basically listed as unreviewed. They are working in their next version to actually make that a little more obvious, which I kind of read into that potentially they're going to add a button that says not approved. Because it felt a little awkward, like I figured I was missing something. Nope. But for the functionality, I can live with just having to leave it in the list. And they have a doc that, it's exact doc at docs.percy.io/docs/Cypress. It's a full tutorial that walks you through getting the npm install done, adding that import into your command.js, and then adding the Percy snapshot, setting up your account. Everything I went through, that's the doc that I followed, and it took me less than half an hour to implement this. What about accessibility testing? We've heard a lot about that recently. That it's pretty much not an option for the most part. And the amount of people that fall into the category of needing accessibility is like 1 in 5. It's pretty high. The thing you can't do, though, is automate 100% of accessibility. But we can automate somewhere between 30 to 50%. We can make sure, is all of our semantic markup correct? Do we put the ARIA tags in there? Do we do all the things that you can computer test? The stuff you can't test is, did my alt tag actually make sense? You know, if I show a logo on the page and it says, this is my fun image, like, that wouldn't make sense to a screen reader. Like, the person would be like, what the heck's my fun image? Versus saying, site logo. So that's the stuff you still have to manually test. But I can test that you at least have the alt image there. And we're going to do this with an open source product called Axe Core. Thankfully, somebody wrote a Cypress wrapper around Axe Core as well. So we have 3 things to do in the Axe Core space. We visit our page, we tell it to inject Axe onto the page, and then wherever we need to test our accessibility, we call cy.checkA11y. And I can check it as often as I need to. Every action that I make that changes the UI, I should be calling this again to make sure I have everything in there. If we go back to our code here, so you get Axe in there. There's a couple packages. There's the Axe Core package. There's also a cypress.axe that I have to import. So we'll import that into our command file. And wherever we want to test, I'm going to test our 404 page, just because it's a nice, simple page. And I have a simple test just to make sure that there's no validations, failures on here. So our check 11, just because I only want to run one of these. npx Cypress open. Let's get our UI reopened here. So we'll click on our 404 page, and we're going to let this thing run. Yes, we got a failure here. And this was not by design. When I actually implemented this, this took about another half hour or the other day. This is the actual error that I got, and I left it in here so we could see it. What it shows right above here is this A11 error. So we get these A11 errors for every one of the errors. What's really cool is when I click on one, we'll zoom this back out. So in the Chrome DevTools, it actually gives me a link over to their documentation to tell me, how do I actually fix this error? What does it actually even mean? The documentation was pretty darn spot on. Told me, hey, I'm missing some semantic stuff here, because the actual error that I was getting says you can only have landmark 1 on main and you have 1 region on node. What this really meant is if I open up my app component, is I've got a div here for my Jumbotron, which says to-do list on it. And then I have all of my different routes. So to fix this, we're going to literally uncomment our main. Test doesn't auto rerun because I didn't change the test. I changed our code. So now I've actually fixed, at least for this page, I've fixed our accessibility issues. At least the ones I can test. So really easy to fix that. And here's the GitHub link for the actual tutorial that I followed through. So this will answer the gentleman's question back there about DevOps from the command line. So our process for this includes a little bit of Cypress and a little bit of stuff outside of Cypress. So we first need to compile our code in our production mode. This means minifying all your code, doing any of your concatenation, any of your cache busting, all the stuff to get your code ready for production. Because we want to test against that build in our CI environment. We need to start our web server. Cypress doesn't prescribe which web server that we want to use. So we have to configure that, start that piece up. You want to wait for your server to actually respond. It takes a moment. And then you run your Cypress test. And then you stop your web server at the end. And to run from the command line, we do npx Cypress run. Runs all of our same tests. A couple things it does differently, it now records videos for us. So we can get an MP4 file of each one of our test cases that ran. So if they do fail, we can see what did the UI actually look like from our CI environment. If I flip over here, because I know there's not a demo slide, and in here, if I flip over and just run one of these, we'll stop this one from, I just say npx Cypress run, and we'll watch it run through all of our test cases, and then we'll look at one of our videos. If you have any questions while we're waiting for this, feel free to ask. This fully runs headless. So this actually runs in Electron from the command line. Any other questions? So this will take just a couple minutes to run here, maybe less than a couple. Can you run it on Karma and can you run it on multiple browsers? The answer is no. It is Chrome only today. That's one of the downsides of Cypress right now. They are working on it, but they've been working on it for a bit to get some cross-browser. But the nice part is if you can get it working on Chrome, about 80% of your functionality is guaranteed, at least 80%, really is guaranteed to work across the browsers. So at least you get the majority of stuff done, and then you can poke test at those some additional items for whether it's Internet Explorer, Firefox, or any one of the other browsers. I'm hoping once Edge comes out of Canary and is now Chrome-based, that maybe Cypress will automatically support it. I do not know. I have not heard anything from them on that point. Other questions? Yep. The question is, I'm already in the Angular space. We've got a lot of protractor test, which is their Selenium-based a solution to run end-to-end test. How do I get Cypress in there? So they will run side by side. And so you can do the npm install Cypress and scaffold out Cypress and start writing new tests inside of Cypress and still run your old protractor test. Once you do get rid of all of your protractor test, I actually do on npm, I've got a schematic for Angular to remove protractor back out. So now our test is actually finished running. Here, we can see all of our test cases. I'm going to zoom out a little bit so the chart looks a little better. One more zoom. There we go. As good as it's going to look. So now we can see how long did it actually take to run, how many test cases did I have, how many passed. If I had failing, maybe how many did it skip. And if I open back up the File Explorer here, I have this videos directory, so every one of these files now actually has, or every test now has a file to go with it. So this is exactly what it ran through. So if I had any failures, I could easily see what those failures actually looked like. Now, granted, out of your CI environment, you have to figure out what to do with those files, whether you upload it to Amazon, like if you're on like a Travis CI, your only option to get them off is to upload them to like an Amazon S3 bucket. Like TeamCity, you could make them as artifacts. You could write a script to copy them somewhere on your network if everything's internal. So lots of options of what to do with the videos. And for the Angular side, I have on the ngconf blog, I have a full tutorial that walks step by step through how do you implement this in the Angular space. Even outside the Angular space, much of it still applies. There's an npm package called npm run all, where I can tell it to run either stuff in serial or parallel. So I can tell it cross-platform, serially run like my linting, my unit test, my Cypress test, and do all of my builds. There's a start server and test package, which allows you to start up your web server, so you give it whatever command you need to start it, and then tell it what URL to go hit, and it waits for the server to start responding, and then you tell it to run your Cypress test. All of those aren't specific to Angular. Really, the only big Angular piece in here is there's an Angular-HTTP server that's used to run the web server. Replace that with whatever web server that you want for your app, and the rest of it would still apply. And it's specific to Travis CI just because that's the environment I implemented in, but the commands are the same regardless. So what might stop you from actually using all of this? So testing is still hard. Not hard from the software side, though. You can see how simple the Cypress API actually is, how easy we were able to test a lot of this stuff. The culture is the hard part. And we started off with the culture at ACME Consulting, not having the testing, trying to get management to still approve putting time in for test. It takes 1.5 to 2x the time to add in all of these test cases than if you just develop the product and then just chucked it out to production. So changing that culture takes a bit of time. We're still in the culture shift, even in my own team. Every time push comes to shove, testing still gets pushed out because customers don't want to wait for stuff sometimes. They pay the price, though, ultimately. They get more bugs. They're truly less happy with the stuff. What is that give and take? They want stuff on a specific schedule. We tell them you're going to have to live with a little bit less quality. If you won't let us remove scope and you won't let us push schedule, quality is what you get. We're slowly changing that culture, though. They're starting to get to the point they're going, we're starting to see some value from the test cases that you're actually running. We're starting to see that this is going to enable you ultimately to get stuff out the door quicker. Every time I send stuff over to my QA department, if they do full regression test, we're at least at 3 to 4 days of them manually testing stuff for the enterprise systems I write. If I wrote all of my test cases that they're doing into Cypress, I could probably run those in under an hour and get all the stuff that they're doing. And we have test cases in our environment, too, that take up to 8 hours to run. About 5 minutes of actually doing work and like 7.5 hours waiting for a third-party system to finish some provisioning so we can go back and run the next 5 minutes of test cases. Like, I can abstract all of that out with that CY server and CY route. Because really what they're waiting for is just the data to come back out of our API with the right value so that the UI changes to what it should be. I can mock that stuff. You can drastically reduce the stuff down. So that's the culture change is that you have to do. And it takes a while to get good at writing tests. I've been revising the test even in this demo for the last 2.5 months. Every time I learn something new at Cypress, it's like, oh, that thing I was doing that I thought was right, let's go change that. It was never truly invalid. There's just a better way to do it. Just like development. When you started as a junior, you knew to do it one way. As you advance up your career, you learn certain things in certain ways to do stuff that are better. We covered the Chrome only. How many of you are behind a proxy server at work? So a couple hands. Cypress has a few issues behind proxy servers. Luckily, you can get around some of those issues by setting an environment variable called no_proxy, and then you put in your local host. This will tell it to skip over trying to go through the proxy server for all of your local host values or URLs. I know the Cypress team is working on making a better story for the proxy servers, but this will be the first thing that you encounter behind a proxy. Even if your proxy is set up like mine, where it's supposed to look at, do you have localhost? Do you have stuff inside the company? If so, don't send it through the network that goes out to the internet. Just send it internally. Cypress doesn't play well with that. Set no_proxy and it'll work beautifully. Also, don't take the all or nothing approach. It's one of the big mistakes that most new teams to testing actually take. They go, if we can't do it all, we're just going to keep waiting until that time that we can dedicate as many sprints as we need to write it all. You never get there. Write a test here, write a test there for your older stuff, write tests before you make changes, write tests for your new stuff. Over time, you're going to build up your test suite. If you have code today that doesn't have test, you just have to assume it works. It's legacy code that basically just works for you. When you go make changes, that's the time to add in new test. So here's what I want all of you room to do. So tomorrow, 'cause we still have one more work day in the week, install Cypress on the project that you have. Create your first test. And tweet at me when you're done with it. Let me know that you tried it out. If you get stuck, tweet at me. I'll respond back. My direct messages are wide open for people to hit me up with questions. I typically respond fairly quickly to that. If you get stuck on something, hit me up. If you have questions, if I don't know the answer, sure, I would either try to find it out for you, or I'll send you over to the Cypress team if it's something that's directly related to them. They are really responsive on Twitter for stuff. I've hit them up multiple times, and I've gotten an answer the same day. Sometimes even within 5 to 10 minutes. So here's some additional resources for you. They're docs. Fantastic. Some of the best docs that are out there. docs.cypress.io. The kitchen sink examples at example.cypress.io. And their Twitter is @cypress_io. All the code that I covered, including the accessibility test, all the Percy stuff, is already on GitHub, but github.com/digitaldrummerj, angular-tutorial-code, and it's in the chapter-UI-test branch. Feel free to pull that down, run npm install, then you can run a Cypress test on that. npx Cypress open, and you can run all the tests that you saw today. Pretty easy to connect with. I've got a website, digitaldrummerj.me. I do blog occasionally. I'm on Twitter, digitaldrummerj. I'm on Twitch. My goal is to live stream a lot more stuff. I actually live streamed on Twitch at digitaldrummerj. Most of creating the the actual Cypress demo that you got to see today, because I was learning it along the way, so I figured, might as well live stream it. And then my company, letyournerdbeheard.com. If you have any questions at all after this, come up and chat with me. Love to chat with you. If you want to get up on the stage and speak, love to chat with you as well. I have some openings in my schedule to actually have some conversations about that, get on the phone after the conference is up. With that, thank you very much for your time, and make sure to fill out evaluations on the way out. Thank you so much.